Thank you, fashionable Earth lovers. Hello.
I'm gonna go this way.
Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. This one is near and dear to my heart. My life partner, Kelly Dowd, is in the audience, and she's in fashion. So I come prepared. Good to meet both of you. Let's give them the lightning sort of origin stories. You came up through learning how to make more sustainable Gap stores, right? Back in the day?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's so great to be here. Thanks to Amy for inviting me. It's my first time, and it's been just an incredible conversation. So I am the former CEO of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, but I actually started as an architect, and I started designing stores for Gap Inc. And really figuring out how to help that company design more sustainably. So lead stores, sustainable practices, and then moved into basically dealing with supply chain. Gap Inc. was a founding member of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, so I've kind of had a front row seat to this industry's journey over the past 15 years. And now I sit on the board of the Apparel Impact Institute, where we're working to really help to identify, fund, and scale solutions to decarbonize the supply chain.
Excellent. And you came up on a similar path, I understand, but now at VF, which is North Face, and what are some of the other brands? If you like the outdoors, you probably know the company behind them.
Exactly. So, well, first of all, thank you, Amy, for the invitation to be here. It's been an inspiring few days, so really excited to be part of this conversation. Yeah, so I've been in sustainability my entire career, and now at VF Corporation, which is one of the world's largest apparel footwear companies and the owner of a number of outdoor activewear brands, including the North Face, Vans, do a little advertisement,
nice.
Smartwool, Timberland, Icebreaker, Eastpak, JanSport. So hopefully you recognize some of those brands. And I'll just say a little bit about VF really quickly. Because of the nature of our outdoor activewear brands, we do have a deep commitment to sustainability, which is why my role was created to really look at how we can drive environmental benefits throughout our business, reduce our impacts, and benefit the communities within which we work. And then should I give a little bit about my origin story as well?
Absolutely.
Okay, because I like to just tell a little bit about my background because I've been in sustainability my entire career, but it really is because of my parents. I feel very fortunate. My dad is a world-renowned solar resource energy guru. Spent a number of years at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I had the opportunity to work with him for a couple of years, which was really fun. And then my mom was a bilingual kindergarten teacher, and we grew up in Eastern Washington after a number of other places like Puerto Rico and Colorado. And she really taught me the value of understanding the needs of the people around you when you design programs. And so her education program is based on the needs of the kindergartners that were coming into our classroom, who their families were migrant workers and only spoke Spanish, or many of them only spoke Spanish. So she changed the course of education in that community.
Fantastic. A head and a heart at your home or on the dinner table there as well. So let's talk about the problems, what it is you're trying to collaborate around. The statistics that I have loaded up for the cocktail party stoppers is if you drank the amount of water it would take to make one t-shirt, it'd take you 2.5 years. That the average American throws away over 80 pounds of clothes a day, and that doesn't even account probably for fast fashion these days. We would need 7 Earths to meet the current consumption habits and all of that. So how would you characterize the earnestness of industry to try to fix this? And is it out of threat of eventual legislation? Is it more aware consumers demanding it? How would you say how far you've come?
Yeah, I think it's probably helpful to start with the context of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, because it is really about how industry came together and why they did. So the SAC has a really interesting origin story in that it started with Patagonia, so Jenna was here yesterday, and Walmart, so 2 really unlikely collaborators coming together and talking about how in 2010, they felt the industry hadn't really done enough to really look at the social and environmental issues that the industry was facing. And part of it was because they were all working in silos, right? So they were all doing good work, but 1, it wasn't driving the kind of impact and the reductions that they wanted to see. And 2, they were doing so on their own, which meant that they didn't have the benefit of being able to collaborate with one another. And the SAC was formed with basically 15 companies around a table, actually gathering every part of the supply chain. So there's been some really interesting conversations around how do you bring unlikely collaborators? Well, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is now Cascale, basically did that, right? So they brought brands, retailers, manufacturers, other NGOs, governments together and said, hey, if we want to tackle the problems of this industry, the only way that we're going to do that is together. And that means that everyone who has a part to play has to have a seat at the table. And that's so fundamentally important, because if you're talking about materials that go into your clothes, if you're talking about where they're produced in terms of sourcing countries or brand processes, unless you have everyone actually represented, you're not going to be able to solve those problems and those challenges. I think it was mentioned, apparel is about 2 to 5% of global emissions, depending on who you ask and what data you use. And that's only going to increase, right? So when you look at how the industry is growing over time, it's projected to grow even more. And so if this industry is serious about hitting their 2030 targets and ultimately getting to net zero by 2050, the only way that you're going to do that is by collaborating. And so as Cascale brought these companies together, it was to do a couple of things. One is it was to start to surface the challenges and the problems that they faced, but it was also to develop standardized tools to measure and assess social and environmental performance. And that was the Higg Index. And over the past 15 years, this organization has essentially built a suite of tools that looks at everything holistically. So it looks at the materials that go into your clothes, it looks at where and how those products are produced, and it looks at brand practices and management. So are you actually engaging with your supply chain? And I think really early on, it was so critically important that unless you looked at holistically what apparel was doing and how it was actually measuring its impact and looking at it apples to apples, it wasn't going to be able to drive change.
Right.
And since the tools have been released, over 20,000 organizations use the tools around the world, and it's been able to help companies measure and assess their impact on everything from water to greenhouse gas emissions to social labor issues, et cetera. So,
And right now, the EU is figuring out how to legislate this, right? And will they use your metrics to ultimately measure who's a good actor or not? Or I guess it'll be part of the suite, right?
yeah, it'll be part of the suite. And I think Jeannie can also speak to, as a specific company, how they're managing legislation. But legislation is a really important part of this, right? Because I think originally the industry thought it was going to be regulated in 2010, and it's part of the reason to start to do this work and figure out how they do it in collaboration with one another before the industry gets regulated. Now you have regulations coming from the EU that ultimately the tools that have been built and the regulation are going to have to start to align. And it's one set of tools, but it's also probably the predominant set of tools that the industry is using. And so there's a lot of work going on right now to align what are regulators asking for, at what level, to what depth and granularity, what do the tools provide, and how do we make sure that companies can not only comply with those regulations, but ultimately go beyond them to drive real impact.
Right. The North Face, for those folks who don't know, is an amazing origin story there. It was started by a guy named Doug Tompkins, one of the original fun hogs, mountain climbers, big wave surfers. His buddy Yvon Chouinard started the company Patagonia. He started the North Face, and they were both sort of anti-consumerists. They put tags on early on. I remember in the 90s saying, are you buying this because you're cold or because you're bored? Think twice about how you consume, which now we live in a culture where Shein and these fast fashion companies, it's the opposite of that. But the companies can't control that, I suppose. Maybe you could try, but you can't control what? The carbon footprint of a factory, how the cotton is grown. Like, what steps have you taken and what pays off the most?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the origin story. I love that. And there's a great Jimmy Chin movie now that kind of goes into the origins.
Exactly.
So a little shout out for that. So what we can control, so we stick to our principles of designing for durability. When you think about the circularity principles, recyclability, disassembly, end-of-life accountability. But I think consumers like the North Face because of its performance. And so we, again, go to our principles of durability, performance, and then good fit. And then when we think about how regulation is sort of a catalyst for the work that we're already doing, it's an exciting time because now especially coming out of the EU, we will be, everything that's coming out of there is sort of changing how we think about manufacturing. So how we engage with our suppliers to decarbonize the supply chain. So rooftop solar on factories, energy efficient lighting, phasing out coal for boilers. So all the work that's happening in the supply chain is really part of this as well. And then it comes down to materials. So we set science-based targets back in 2019. And through that process, we really understand our impacts. We know that 70% of our impacts are from raw material extraction, processing, and production. So it comes down to materials and factories. So that's where we put our emphasis and we put our focus. And again, back to our principles of designing with the best materials we possibly can, and now combining that with sustainable material substitution. So when the North Face is doing an excellent job with sourcing recycled polyester, for example, instead of virgin polyester, and really thinking about the design of the product from the very beginning so that the end of life, we know how we're going to recycle that product, keep it in use longer because of the durability aspect, or reuse it, get it out back into the market through some of our re-commerce projects and initiatives. So it's a real holistic view of how we get those products out to market.
I look at stories about what the profit margin is on a Louis Vuitton bag. I think if anybody can afford to come up with new textiles or circular, supply chains, it's these really famous brands. But even if they were throwing billions, is the tech there yet to do what's needed to be done? And it's just a matter of convincing a factory or helping finance a factory owner in Asia somewhere to convert?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think one of the things that we've been hearing over the past couple of days is like, this is not necessarily a technology issue, right? So there is a lot of technology out there, but I think that part of what needs to happen is this collaboration that we're talking about, right? And unlikely partners. So at Apparel Impact Institute, we identify, fund, and scale solutions that help to decarbonize the supply chain. But it takes a couple of things, right? It takes brands and retailers who are willing to work with their manufacturers. It takes manufacturers in these sourcing countries who basically are then incentivized to decarbonize, and it takes funding, right? So you kind of need all of those pieces, which means you can't just have a brand, retailer, and manufacturer relationship, which is where I think a lot of this work has been. We now are starting to bring financial institutions, so philanthropic banks, et cetera, to the table and say, okay, if we're serious about decarbonizing the supply chain in apparel, we need to do that in partnership. And that sometimes means that you need to come up with creative ways to finance this, right? There was a great comment earlier about we can't continue to basically push debt down to sourcing countries. In apparel, that is so incredibly important. When it comes to regulation or even when it comes to financing this, like we cannot be continuing to push all of this down to the supply chain and have manufacturers actually bear the brunt of this. It has to be done in partnership and in collaboration with one another. And that's where I think funding and financing is such a critical, important part of it. At Apparel Impact Institute, we have developed a fashion climate fund. And so we're trying to raise $250 million in catalytic funding that we think then unlocks $2 billion in financing this decarbonization. But again, you need all of those partners at the table to come up with those solutions and those financial mechanisms that will allow the supply chain to decarbonize. I don't want to take innovation off the table because I think, as Jeannie can talk about, yeah, you absolutely need to look at next gen materials. You need to look at more sustainable materials, et cetera. But the things like, eliminating coal, energy efficiency, and renewables are things we know how to do right now. And we know that that will probably address almost 60% of the impacts.
Yeah, I know we were talking a bit about this New York State fashion bill, which is basically trying to legislate a lot more transparency. But as it was explained to me, that pushes a lot of onus down on the small factory owner somewhere who doesn't have, an accountant just to dedicate to their scope 3 emissions and all of that. And then there's no enforcement. What they could really need help with is replacing their boiler with solar panels, right? Is that what you find?
Yeah, I mean, with the legislation coming out, which we are very actively engaged when helping to influence, we want to see impact. We want to see, the reporting, the traceability is incredibly important because we want to have the ability to disclose our information to all our relevant stakeholders, including shareholders. But at the end of the day, what we want to really do is drive the positive solutions. And so again, back to the European legislation, which is really thinking about material sourcing, for example, that helps us think about our strategies around, when you think about rubber that comes from a rubber plantation or cotton, comes from a cotton field, most of our materials are so connected to nature. So we're looking at these nature-based solutions that drive impact. And just back to the partnership comment that you made earlier, Amina, we have deep partnerships with farmers, ranchers, and growers to help them convert land from monoculture practices to regenerative practices, much of what we've heard about today. And I've had the opportunity to go to some of these places like in Thailand where we've helped over 500 farmers convert their land, and now they're seeing economic diversity from selling fruit and rubber, and we're seeing the rubber show up in the soles of our shoes. It's really exciting. And so again, sort of
instead of incentivizing a grower to go all rubber trees, you say, no, we'll pay you to put a lot more diversity out here
Absolutely.
for nature and still buy your rubber.
Exactly. Because then they're selling fruit and medicine, and then they know they have a solid source of a sourcing partner from us for the rubber.
Right. What is your message as we wind down to consumers who want to make the right choices and want to also be fashionable, as is the dichotomy these days? What should they look for, and what do you hope folks take away?
Yeah, I hope consumers start to pay more attention to the hard work that's underway. You know, it's hard to tell the regenerative agriculture story and then tie it to the rubber in a shoe when a consumer goes to the store to buy something that's for fit, color, performance, and price. And so I hope the consumer takes the time to become more educated and really understand about all the great work that's going on and all the collaboration.
Well, when you see a brand like, is it Veja, the Spanish brand that does more sustainable rubbers being rewarded, you know, as a trendy sort of brand? Is that an indication of something happening?
I think so. I think the awareness is getting there. And then, you know, we hear more consumers are interested in secondhand products. So some of our take back and re-commerce programs seem to be getting a little bit more traction these days. And so consumer education is absolutely critical.
Final thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, on the consumer side, one of the things people always ask me, given that, you know, I led the coalition, they're like, well, who do you shop with, right? And I would always say, if they're on the Cascale, if they're a member of Cascale, I know that they're at least trying, right? So I think it's really important to remember that you have a very wide spectrum of companies on their sustainability journey. And what I think is really important is that you're making sure that everyone is continuing to improve their performance, right? And so I look for companies who are trying. I look for companies who are, you know, basically trying to put in the effort, they're putting in the investment, they are doing something. It's not everything and no company is perfect, but I think that we should be rewarding companies who are actually making that first step, and they're continuing to kind of step by step build their sustainability strategy and go deeper and engage with their supply chain partners, because that is ultimately what's going to change this industry.
Sure. And you vote with your wallet and dream of a future where the color, the size, the fit, the price are all sustainable, because that's just the standard. At least that's what you're working towards. And we thank you for it.
Thank you so much.
Big hand for our experts here.